Hello, good morning or good afternoon to everyone out there, and welcome to our exciting roundtable discussion today on sports, trade, and advocacy in and around the African sports ecosystem. I am your moderator for today, Dr. Lindsay Sarah Krasnoff, and I'm absolutely thrilled and an honor to join us today. A few technical instructions before we begin. First, this panel is going to be interpreted en français, so you should be able to find that within the Zoom capacity. And secondly, to our audience, please feel free to submit questions. We will hopefully have time at the end of the initial discussion for some question and answer from the audience, and we're looking forward to having your really good probes into some of the to delve more deeply into the topic at hand. With that ado, I will hand over the mic to Mr. David Luke, who is the coordinator of African Trade Policy Center of the African Trade Policy Center at the UN Economic Commission for Africa.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for that introduction, and hello everyone, distinguished colleagues, friends, and everyone who has joined us for this webinar. I'm pleased to join you today to discuss the opportunities for the role of sport to support the inclusive implementation of the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and how to leverage its potential to unlock the social and economic empowerment of African youth, women, and people with disabilities. This will help to contribute to progress towards achieving Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. As we all know, sports is universal and has a strong diplomatic capacity to bring people together across borders, age, gender, and politics. Sports competitions such as the European Champions League and the US NBA are great examples of how sport reinforce economic integration by creating a sense of normalcy of economic transactions across borders, underpinned by the love of sports. In this sense, sports diplomatic capabilities can be leveraged to facilitate the implementation of the AfCFTA and regional integration in Africa. Multiplying this with sports' ability to attract young people and with young African entrepreneurial drive, we have a very strong potential for harnessing the benefits of the AfCFTA and developing the sports industry in Africa. So examining the role of sport from an economic development and trade angle, sports is a multi-billion-dollar industry which can enable the African region to put muscle behind the efforts to boost international trade, support business growth, entrepreneurship and job creation, enhance countries' reputation, attract investment while generating income from sports-related manufacturing, sales, and services. It is against this background that we see a potential role of sports in the implementation of the AfCFTA, as it can target youth, women, and persons with disabilities, whilst boosting the regional sports ecosystem through increased regional trade in goods and services, innovation, and entrepreneurship. The AfCFTA agreement recognizes the importance of improving export capacity of informal suppliers, MSMEs, women, and youth. The potential market created under the AfCFTA creates unique opportunities for all of these actors through increased access to new continental export markets, regional value chains, and digital trade and e-commerce, as well as expanded opportunities in agriculture, manufacturing, and services as sectors that are expected to gain new trade opportunities through the AfCFTA. With levels of high youth unemployment on the continent and the engagement of youth in the informal economy, the AfCFTA can address the demographic challenge of absorbing Africa's 252 million youth in productive activities. The AfCFTA could lead to an increase in employment by 1.2%, creating more than 2 million jobs in various regions of the continent, with more significant long-term impacts, according to analysis that we have done at the at the ECA. One of the sectors that could benefit from the AfCFTA is the manufacturing sector, and specifically the manufacturing of sporting goods. With reduction in tariffs and reduction of non-tariff barriers for the harmonizations of standards across the continent, the AfCFTA could increasingly incentivize African manufacturing of sporting goods and harness from regional value chains and economic diversification on the continent. And harnessing this development will not only enable inclusive jobs and economic development, but also enable sports goods at affordable prices, as costs of shipment, customs tariff, and the like will decrease significantly. This will enable a larger part of the African population to engage in sports activities. So with all these perspectives, what we're doing at the Economic Commission for Africa, we have introduced a new work stream on trade and sports to investigate this relatively unexplored linkage between sport and the inclusive implementation of the AfCFTA. Through a range of activities, we hope that this, our work stream, will help to generate the understanding of how building and growing an inclusive and sustainable sports ecosystem can promote regional cooperation, entrepreneurship, employability, innovation, manufacturing, and ultimately inclusive African trade. So the program of work on sports and trade also includes research and policy components on lessons learned from sports to support regional cooperation, boost inter-African trade, and improve peace and security on the continent. It will also consider the role of sports in the implementation of the AfCFTA, including sports as trading services and related issues such as intellectual property, investment, competition, and opportunities for manufacturing and job creation. So let me conclude by saying that the African sports industry can serve as an effective enabler of inclusive implementation of the AfCFTA, with its potential to generate jobs and vital training for youth, girls, and women. So I look forward to a fruitful discussion and solutions on the current challenges in the sports ecosystem, as you also explore this linkage between trade and sports, and also how we could further encourage inter-African trade and learning from best practices of engaging youth, women, and other stakeholders in trade innovation and entrepreneurship. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm conscious of the time. I have a much longer statement, but I have tried to just highlight the key aspects, and I look forward really to the discussions ahead. Thank you. And back to you, Lindsay.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Luke. Although one can certainly go on in much greater depth and detail, that helped to provide a really great context and overview for our audience who is joining us today. And I can certainly say I've been teaching a graduate class this semester in sports diplomacy within global sport, and one of the really exciting topics each time it comes up week over week when we talk about sport in Africa has been the way that it can work across a variety of different channels and help stimulate different types of economic opportunities, as well as opportunities for others. So I'm really excited for our conversation today. But I would like to introduce our guest speakers for today, moving us a little bit forward through. Thank you to the entire team that's put together today, both within UNECA as well as Africa Sport United. I think they've done a great job in bringing together a variety of different viewpoints to help to unpack and to contextualize the various different ways that sport can be a tool. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Thomas Vernon. who is the CEO of the Right to Dream Group.
Thanks very much for inviting me on, and congratulations to Gabrielle and the guys for putting together a great panel. It's a privilege to talk today. I founded Right to Dream in Ghana 22 years ago, starting from very modest beginnings. We've grown into one of the most successful football academies on the continent that will now be replicated in Egypt, and construction has started there, and is also the first youth organization in Africa to purchase a professional football club in Europe, which we did in 2015 in Denmark with FC Nordsjælland, and are about to replicate that in North America as well. So it's a privilege to be here, and this is just my short introduction, but I look forward to getting into the topic and the discussion here.
Great, thank you so much. Also joining us today is Mr. Madani Tall, who is, amongst many other attributes in his impressive CV, the chairman of Sports City Diamniado. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. The Dakar Diamniado Sports City project.
Thank you very much. Indeed, my name is Madani Tall. I'm chairman of Dakar Diamniado Sports City. You can just say DDSC. It's going to be easier, I think, from now on. And I'm very happy to participate in the panel. I think the topic is quite timely and certainly for me strategic enough to give it some time. I'm an economist by training, and I spent 25 years of my life at the World Bank, finishing as the director of operations. And many wonder how I come to sport, because maybe they expected me to be either in the bank somewhere or government somewhere, but clearly my passion is sport. I have a son who plays professional football in Belgium, and I've been myself practicing sport since my very young age. So it's not by accident that I come into this, and I've become a major investor in probably one of the biggest projects in West Africa, and I'll be getting a chance to discuss that later on. But I'm very happy to be here and be part of this distinguished panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that. Progressing forward, to warm up our audience a little bit, I'd like to start with a question that helps to provide some context. You know, it's often said that sport is multidimensional and works across the UN Sustainable Development Goals to help stakeholders move closer towards their 2030 objectives. From your perspectives in the various different work that you do, what does this mean to you? And how can sport support the inclusive implementation of the AfCFTA, especially its ability to reach the youth, promote gender equality, and those with disabilities?
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think first thing I'd like to add a little bit, I know that David was conscious of his time, but I think that there's an important sort of addition on the introduction here, which is that in the implementation of this strategy, Africa has the opportunity to be the undisputed global leader in this space. And I think that's one of the unique and exciting points. You know, when we look at the grossly sort of underserved development of sport on the continent over the last 50 or 60 years, and the remarkable results that we see, both in terms of the performance of our athletes who retain their African passports, but also those who represent the continent, you know, under different nationalities, the results are quite simply phenomenal. And I think that one of the most exciting things about AfCFTA and the momentum that Mr. Luke outlined there is that this is really the time for Africa to take its rightful place as the global leader in sports, both from a youth development and from a performance perspective. And, you know, I don't really need to go into the statistics in too much detail, but you know, if we look across the performance from East Africa in athletics, or what we've seen in UFC recently, where we don't even have a single UFC gym on the entire continent, and we have 3 world champions, or the makeup of the French national team, with a very heavy debate around that, but still the facts of where the origins of Africa's sons and how they're performing. There is a remarkable opportunity to be the global leader in sports performance and sports development, and the additional inspiration that provides, not just being a player but being the best. I think if we look at Usain Bolt and the impact on Jamaica, and envisage that on a continental front across multiple sports, this is even more exciting. And then when I take that into the Right to Dream context, I think one of the things that we're most proud of at Right to Dream is the export of an African sports brand to Europe and to North America. So rather than looking at this just within the confines of what we can develop on our own continent, the export potential of the performance excellence and culture and values that underpin African sports that are unique and provide unique learnings to the world, provide for me a fascinating export opportunity as well for the African continent through its sports IP and sports brands.
Yeah, no, very much. It says a lot, especially when we get a little further into our discussion about what all the possibilities then translate into. Thank you very much. Mr. Tall.
Thank you. I think it's an important question. I think there's never been any doubt about the youth potential in Africa, about the desire to excel, about the variety of skills and so on. I think clearly, and there's been a few efforts to engage the youth, I think, in various countries, to try to harness this energy and help them towards this vision of excelling and being whether it's world-class athletes or professional footballers or boxers or whatever. I think that the problem has always been the kind of infrastructure that was put at their disposal that would allow them to be competitive, that would allow them to excel, that would allow them to basically have a world-class type of performance on one hand, but also to become, not all youth want to become professional, but they want to become model citizens. They want to develop skills and qualities that sports, I think, enable you to do, whether it's discipline, whether it's method, whether it's competitiveness in the right sense of it. I think, and the lack of infrastructure, the lack of, I would say even political support in a voluntary manner, has really, I think, hampered the development of youth sports in Africa. You have ad hoc interventions, you have a few initiatives here and there, but systematically for sports, and especially for youth to be seen as a primary agenda, whether it's for government or even UN agencies, I think that's only beginning to start talking about this, because there's a recognition that the youth makes up more than 50% of the population. And if you don't start dealing with them on the education front, but also I think on the sports, leisure, and social front, I mean, it is bound to be a problematic, I think, for everybody. So there's the infrastructure need, and I think this is one area that I'm basically myself at my own small personal level trying to correct. But there's also the policy, the whole policy area, where I think a lot more needs to be done to be able to enable these youth. They have the desire, they have the natural capacity, they have the will, but they don't have the amenities that they need, I think, to be able to excel.
Thank you. So that, Mr. Vernon, did you have something you wanted to add on there?
Yeah, if I could just add on the policy, I think that obviously the on-continent policy is rightly identified as a major area of focus, but I believe that this is a time that we also need to look at the international policy. and the the restrictive, oppressive policies that we still see from FIFA, for example. It still blows my mind that we can have 50 plus countries on the African continent and 5 slots at the World Cup. And then we have 40 something countries in Europe and they enjoy 14 slots at the World Cup. And so, a lot of the reasons that we're struggling locally with infrastructure and policy is that there's international policy, which is, in my opinion, can't be described as anything else but racially discriminatory. And so I think that at this point, we need to look at what are the international policies that we see from organizations like FIFA and the implication that they have on the continent before we then take the look, or maybe we run it in parallel in terms of how continental policy is developed, as was rightly said. So I think that's the starting point on a lot of this. And then on the other side, we can see, more progressive examples like through FIBA and NBA's approach towards Africa and more progressive policy that still needs to be scrutinized to make sure that that international brands like the NBA are coming onto the continent with the right intentions and with the right long-term development motivations. But I think that we see them in a slightly better space than we still see with this, with this horrendous World Cup policy that just for some reason still doesn't seem to be part of a conversation. So I think that international policy space is something that I hope can be looked at in more detail in conjunction.
Thank you both. And you both touch on some of the barriers, infrastructure, the policy, especially at the international level as well, to strengthening the African sports ecosystem. Are there any other key barriers to keep in mind in terms of what needs to be overcome in order to strengthen the ecosystem? And how do you see AfCFTA as being able to contribute to overcoming these hurdles?
Maybe I can start on that. I think, having come myself from, the bigger UN family, I consider the World Bank to be part of the UN family. I think one of the things that I thought was very useful when I was working with development agencies were, first of all, knowledge development, having putting in play the right knowledge, the right analysis, the right data. I think this is an area even more important than resources these institutions can bring. At the end of the day, you're not going to develop these countries with what I call development aid. It has to be internally generated. It has to be, policies have to be internally invented. But I think based on global knowledge, based on specific sector knowledge, I think there hasn't been a lot of studies in sport. It is beginning now because many people are understanding sports as an economic entity. It's 2% of global GDP today, so it's no longer irrelevant. But if you go to countries, ministries of sports sometimes don't even have paper for the photocopy machine. That's the reality. They're the last to serve because governments don't consider a minister of sport as important as a minister of finance or minister of education or minister of foreign affairs. And I think until that changes, these sectors are always going to be the last served. You cannot develop sports and address all these needs for the youth, for the professional athletes to develop excellence if, investing in sport infrastructure, for example, is going to cost you as much as investing in a 5-star hotel in terms of fiscal, in terms of, the administrative bottlenecks and things of that nature. So I think the advocacy and the awareness raising that these institutions can do is in terms of the right policy dialogue they have with authorities in these countries to make sure that, it becomes it becomes an important part of the dialogue, not something that comes after thought or that is discussed after education has been discussed, health has been discussed, budget support has been discussed, infrastructure, the next bridge has been discussed. Then, we have 5 minutes to discuss youth, sports, the disabled and so on. So, and I think that's the reality today. So there may be a willingness to walk the talk, but it's not happening yet, in my opinion. And I know many of these countries. I've traveled around, I've worked in many of them, and believe me, some people think I'm crazy by putting money in a soccer field or in an Olympic pool or in a basketball field. Why don't you build hotels, or why don't you invest in a power generation? People need electricity, and this is the kind of statement you still get from decision makers. So there's a long way to go. There's really a long way to go, and I think you cannot force anything down on countries, but at least you can advocate. You can raise good policies in such a way that it becomes so flagrant that if they don't do that, basically they're going to be left behind, and they may have down the road, I think, problems with the youth and with the youth in their countries.
I would add a couple of points. One would be to look at the extent to which we're going to allow international policy to dictate local policy. The corruption that exists within the game, football, and in many other sports on the continent is still a very significant barrier to investment and growth and development. And in many cases, that comes from international policies in Zurich or other places that prevent government from doing what's best for their sport in their country. And we've seen many examples where governments have wanted to push the agenda on developing football in their countries, but aren't able to because FIFA will expel you if there's any kind of government interference. And there are obviously some merits in that concept as well. But I think that Africa has to find its own balance for how it wants to develop football on its continent, with policies that are relevant and specific to the African continent and not generic sort of global policy. The second thing I think is that we need to create policy and incentive to hold on to our biggest asset, which is our athletes. And it seems to me by the month that you see a Cameroonian-born star playing for the German national team, or a Guinea-born star playing for the Spanish national team, and this is continuous. Imagine if, going back to Usain Bolt, if he'd naturalized for America, what the loss to, just as an example, what the loss to the Jamaican brand would be. And I think that the loss that we have of our stars, because the incentives for them to stay on the continent, or the conditions or the incentives that are coming internationally to entice our greatest athletes to represent other countries, is a major loss to the creation of the brand and the understanding of the business that is sports on the continent, and how that can be commercialized. So I would say that international policy that isn't specific and local enough for us to develop, and the strategy to hold our greatest assets within this are two key areas to be looked at.
Can I comment on this, because I think it's an important point, and I agree with is it Tom?
Yeah.
I agree with Tom in principle, but I would go a step further. I don't think you can decrete by law, whether it's international or national, opportunity or the lack of opportunity. I think one of the reasons, if you ask most of these players, if they had the facilities, the salaries, the training grounds, the commercial opportunities, probably they would want to play for their countries, because everybody's a patriot. So that's a reality that you cannot decrete by law that people have to play, and no policy, whether it's the UN, whether it's their own country, could make that happen. So that's why I think we need to see the problem more upstream. Build facilities, build training, make sports an economic activity, so that you develop professional you develop professional leagues in Africa to start with, and you develop the countries. If people cannot even fix a knee injury because there's no hospital, because there's not the right you cannot blame them for wanting to better their life. And I know that's not what you're doing. You're talking about the consequence, the fact that they're there. But I'm saying we need to look at it more upstream to correct it progressively. It's not going to happen overnight. And I think that's why the kind of facilities we are trying to build, that will have, FIFA regulated soccer field, that will have medical center, that will have the right kind of training, will give access to youths in school in the greater Dakar area to develop these champions, so that maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, at the time when you're also developing, local championships, you're working with sponsors, for people to say, hey, maybe I better stay here and want to play for my national team, because the national team is much more competitive. They train in Senegal. Today when the Senegalese national team comes, they stay in a hotel in Dakar and they travel an hour and a half every day to go train, because the only place where they can have a good soccer field is in Sali. That's about 100 kilometers from Dakar. There's no way you can sustain excellence by having this kind of practice. And I'm talking about Senegal, which is one of the most developed countries. Imagine if you're in Central African Republic, or you're in Chad, or you're in Benin. I mean, it's even worse. So I think we really have to look at sports as an economic entity, as something that gives opportunity to youth, opportunity to better themselves, but also opportunity to generate revenue, be able to fulfill a decent livelihood, and really help their families and so on. Once you do that, then you can have a conversation on the policy. But having a conversation on policy before you're able to really fix what needs to be fixed, to be able to have an even playing field, at least in terms of the materiality of sport and how you do sport, I think it's going to be a very, very difficult debate to win. That's really my own personal assessment.
I agree with that, and a lot of the policy that I was hinting at is related to putting the infrastructure in place, but we can also have government policies and incentives to hold on to our best athletes while we make the catch-ups in terms of infrastructure as well. So I think that we can approach it from both angles. And what I think is even more interesting is that I believe that, we saw this with the year of the return, which was very successful in Ghana. And the other day I saw an interview between Stevie Wonder and Oprah Winfrey, where he said that he's moving back to Ghana because he can't stand the idea of how his grandkids are going to grow up in America with the racial issues there. And so what I believe is that we can even reverse this trend, so that athletes who are born in Europe or born in America of African origin, who are looking to reconnect with their roots and would actually like to represent their mother country, the country of their parents or their great grandparents. And we can actually ultimately start to see the reverse of what we've seen with athletes going elsewhere, but actually coming back to represent something which has more meaning for them than the difficulties that are often experienced as an athlete. If we take football as an example, the situation of racism in Europe is still extremely serious. And these athletes are looking for countries that embrace their identity more than we see from some of these national teams. So I think, as I said before, that there's an export opportunity. There's also kind of a repatriation opportunity within sports to bring the more distant sons of Africa and daughters of Africa back onto the continent to represent and build the brands of our national teams and our clubs. And I believe that with the BAL, the new basketball league, that we will start to see American-born athletes wanting to take ownership in BAL franchises and play for BAL franchises, because they have more control over the destiny of the league and the identity of the league than they do within the NBA, for example. So I think the opportunity in that space, when the policy and infrastructure is in place, is absolutely massive.
Great, thank you both. I think the various different points that you were making really kind of tie into this aspect of culture and how it's necessary to change cultural attitudes towards sport and its uses as a tool in helping through some of this, as well as sports cultural attitude towards it as well. So working kind of at different angles. Thinking a little bit more specifically, how can sports and the sports business sectors help to empower particularly women and youth economically and harness their entrepreneurial capacity through the AfCFTA?
I think that the growth of the women's game at the moment that we're experiencing in football, that there's a unique opportunity within African women's football. We will be launching next year a fully professional women's team in Egypt, and we have already the only residential girls football academy on the continent, based in Ghana at Right to Dream. And we've seen with great delight our young girls joining us from tough environments in Ghana, through the combination of education and sport, access scholarships to some of the best universities and schools in America, and are now going on to progress dual careers as student athletes and as athletes who work as well afterwards. And so I think that the US model, student athlete model, and the integration of our elite sports development into the academic, into the school sector is a really important thing for us to look at in this regard, because if we go too far down replicating the European model towards sports, I think we miss the opportunity for the more holistic development of our children through the combination of academics and football. And certainly in Ghana, which where I lived for 17 years, the tradition and the legacy from the 50s and the 60s was towards the student athlete, and we had the teams known as the academicals and so on, where many of our best coaches and players came from. So I think at this juncture we can take more inspiration from the US student athlete model. And then when we look, in 2008, I founded a Paralympic program in Ghana that qualified 4 athletes to the London 2012 games for Paralympic sport. And the opportunities in Paralympic sport, again on the African continent, to be the global leader are sadly quite phenomenal, due to the disability rates on the continent being the highest in the world. But that presents a great opportunity, and the inspirations that we've seen to break down barriers and stigma, for example, from the Nigerian Paralympic weightlifting team that is the world leader, and the impact that ultimately has on perceptions of disability, which can be very, very challenging, certainly in West Africa, presents great opportunities as well for us to progress those agendas. So I think the student athlete and the disability opportunities I've touched on there are tremendous.
But I agree with everything that has been said. I think it's before even talking about sports, I think there is a major effort that governments need to make to deal with disability on the continent in general, even if it's not related to sport. I think it's a major issue. I still think it is not being dealt with both financially or in terms of policy. You still have government buildings. We don't have, work through ways for the disabled people or people that are challenged. And so I think there's a big debate or discussion that needs to be, conversation that needs to be had on that. And I think that's one of the value added of a UN agency, that these kind of issues can be brought to the forefront, can get people mobilized around, and can agree on certain performance targets with governments. I'm not talking about making them conditions to access loans or knowledge or other things, but certainly, I've seen projects from UN agencies much more demanding on other things and not discuss at all, some of these issues. So that's, I would say, in terms of in general. Now, in terms of sports, I think working with federations, working with the local Olympic committees, making sure that they address this in their programs, but they also have the kind of resources that they need to have to be able to organize a number of activities. I think for disabled and fragile people, I think is important. It's always going to be much easier, at least it is today, to organize an international football game. You will get sponsors on that quickly. You will get government resources on that quickly. You will get security arrangements and things like that than organizing, let's say, games for disabled or challenged people. And I think these are areas that where the UN agencies, I think the French are doing a lot in this area. They have a program funded by AFD, which is now going into some capital cities, funding places they call agoras, where youth in certain neighborhoods can come at certain hour of the day and train, and they have specifically designed infrastructure for access for all, basically, including disabled people. I mean, it starts with, I think, programs like that. This is pilot, of course, it needs to be expanded, but I think you won't be able to do it unless you bring private sector into the mix. Financing will not come from governments. They don't have the resources. They have other priorities that get them elected or not, okay? And that's the reality. And I think we have to work within that reality. And so private sector, I think for me, is the answer. But private sector is not going to invest to lose money. If projects are going to be sustainable, they have to make money. We're investing almost $70 million on this project. Of course, it has to make money. We have a Marriott hotel that is being built right next to the stadium. We have all these facilities, fitness, because there's a big UN agency that's going to move in there. We're going to have 4,000 people right next to the complex. And we know we're going to generate money. Unless you know that and you generate money, you cannot do these other things. And you cannot sustain the project. And if you want to work over the medium term to long term, your operation has to be financially sustainable. And then it gives you the fiscal space, the resources to be able to engage in certain activities that are really what I would call, path breakers, to lead the way, to handhold, so that it becomes, embedded more in terms of, government policies and have others to also do it. If you don't approach it like that, I think it's going to be difficult, and most people will just give it lip service, or they will deal with it when there's a UN mission coming into the country. And once you leave, then, nothing will happen. I know exactly how that works.
Thank you both for that. Shifting gears just a little bit to think very specifically about your two different organizations. When we talk about sports diplomacy, we talk about when the sports world intersects with the function of diplomacy, the communication, negotiation, and representation that naturally occurs through people-to-people cultural, technical, or knowledge exchange in and around the field. And in our globalized, internet-connected world, the issue of who conducts diplomacy has become more diffuse. It's no longer only the domain of diplomats or official state representatives, but ever more athletes, coaches, teams, federations, and organizations that are playing a role. So with this in mind, Tom, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the Right to Dream Network, which spans from Ghana to Denmark and Egypt, and you also have an education exchange opportunity with a school in the United States. In what ways does sports diplomacy play a role in your work to promote the next generation of African leaders? And here we're also keeping in mind that sports diplomacy helps to communicate, negotiate, and represent intra-African, as well as about Africa to the rest of the world.
Well, I think that Africa has a long-standing tradition and its own interpretation in regard to how they leverage sports for diplomacy. And Nelson Mandela's quotes in this regard get used all over the world all of the time. But in 2006, now President George Weah visited Right to Dream, and transformed the vision of Right to Dream in regard to what the purpose of our athletes were that we were developing, and what their role should be for the continent moving forwards. And that really flipped our perspective. And I don't believe that we're ever going to see a European win the Ballon d'Or and then become the president of their country, as President Weir did. So we have a unique roadmap for what's possible, and again, many of the actions of Didier Drogba serve as an example to African youths that context doesn't exist in many other places, and that's a wonderful opportunity. And so for us in that regard, we build the framework of Right to Dream on how will you leverage the opportunities and privileges of Right to Dream, whether that be when you end up at Stanford University, as one of our boys is attending now as one of their top soccer players, or students in the Ivy League. And we've managed to raise about $45 million of scholarships in America. Or if you end up as a star player in Europe, and which we've managed to do many times as well. And it starts from setting a different expectation in your role as an athlete in 2021. And for our students who know that when they're selected from their communities to come and live at Right to Dream, that it's a huge privilege, but none of them feel that they were the best kid from their community. They all feel the pain of those that they leave behind and the lack of the opportunities for those that they leave behind. And so for us, it's then very simple to say, okay, how will we channel our education? Which courses will you choose? What tone of voice will you find, starting on your social media and all the way through around the situations that you want to change on your continent? And that we find our students adopt as a very, very natural role within an athlete. And then when they look internationally, and especially to African American or Black British athletes like Colin Kaepernick, LeBron James, and Marcus Rashford, they're seeing these examples now, and this is becoming a global norm as well, that you leverage your platform in a very different way than was previously taken. But I think that Africa and Mandela and the Rugby World Cup and George Weir are really the trailblazers in that regard. And when I talk about the African sports export opportunities, these cultural principles and values which have been in play for a very long time are things that I believe we need to do a better job of explaining and highlighting to the world, that these are ideas born on the continent already that have been alive for a very long time. And we will tell and export those stories and monetize those stories and build brands around those stories, which then leads to role modeling. And for our athletes at Right to Dream, it's very natural and very obvious for them to see these opportunities as an opportunity to change their communities or their countries. And many of our kids talk about aspiring to become the next George Weir, both on and off the pitch.
It's not an easy question for me, but what I know is certainly sports can be used basically to promote countries, to promote image, and a few countries are doing that. I mean, the most notable is Qatar, that got a famous French team, and not many people knew where Qatar was, I think 10 years ago. They heard about it, they knew it was a rich oil country or gas country, but their presence in conversations, in newspapers, in discussions were very marginal. Because Qatar bought the PSG and the EU came and bought Manchester City and a few of these things, you can see a lot of the countries that have maybe wealth, but that politically were not considered major countries are investing a lot in sports to give them that kind of recognition. Some are doing it as also serving the sports route to get economic opportunities. I don't want to speak for Rwanda, but clearly Rwanda is a good example. When you see Rwanda on, I think, Arsenal's jersey, there's a reason for that. There is a reason for that. I would suspect the reason would be to get Rwanda on the map positively. The reason would be to generate economic interest, because Arsenal is a global team with the fans all over the world. It would be to maybe get opportunities in tourism, in trade, maybe in education, in research, I don't know. But so sports has this power today because it is a major economic force. So to use it diplomatically, quote unquote, I think makes sense in that way. But I see another way, which is more getting nations together, getting people together, creating a form of brotherhood through sports. I think that's also very important. But as with anything, that also has a cost, and who bears that cost? You know, that is the question. You know, can these kinds of partnership, diplomatic effort be sustained without much resource? You know, that's the question I have in my mind. So there's a difference between, you know, what I call economic diplomacy, using sports as a lever, and diplomacy, using sports for diplomacy as, you know, joining nations together, bringing tensions down. You know, sometimes when countries are in conflict, before they meet officially, the soccer team from country A plays country B in country C. You know, these kinds of initiatives just to get the tension down. So I think it has a role, and it depends how you want to use it, and, you know, how much push you give it in terms of resource, in terms of attention, in terms of media coverage to make it happen. But there's certainly potential for diplomacy.
Move over into some of the questions that have been coming in furiously from our audience. Let's see. First up here, we have all kinds of questions. I think, Tom, here's one that came in for you. What are some of the do's and don'ts when one wants to set up a sporting program like the Right to Dream Academy in Ghana?
I mean, I think in some ways I have to unfortunately reinforce what Madani said, which is maybe start by having very little expectation of public sector. It's often a place where I think people are looking, and budgets and often sort of infrastructure within public sector, Ministry of Youth and Sports, and the example of you know, the photocopier not having paper is true in many examples. There are a few notable exceptions, and for example, my limited experiences in Rwanda have been quite remarkable in terms of progressiveness towards sports. But I think that not building business plans or expectations for public sector support for initiatives is key, and that engagement, realistic engagement with private sector is the way forwards. And often I see a degree of unrealism about why private sector should release dollars into sports programs, almost that it's kind of a duty or an obligation, rather than crafting commercially viable win-win situations for private sector and sports development on the continent. So I think that understanding the motivations of private sector as to why they would invest is the anchor of any business plan for sports development in Africa. And that would be my sort of advice. And then, as I said, the don't would be related to public sector expectation. And then the other thing that I would say is don't get in if you're not expecting 10 years before you see any results. There's no short-term fix especially in sports generally, but especially in African sports. So take a long-term view and have a really detailed understanding of African private sector perspective and appetite for sports, because those are the two things that are going to be the foundations of success.
Great, thank you. Madani, a question for you. In terms of trade, what regions or nations do you see as being the most important regions to engage in, and which sports do you think are currently underutilized in facilitating this?
I don't want to shortchange any region. I mean, clearly there's potential all over the continent. There's no doubt about it. If you look at regions in terms of grouping, whether you're talking about West Africa, you have major countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and so on. You know, well-developed markets. I mean, well-connected, I think, to whether it's Europe, the US, Asia, and so on. Same thing if you're looking at Southern Africa, same thing if you look at East Africa, same thing if you look at the MENA region, you know, the Maghreb. So I don't want to shortchange any region. And I think in all these regions, I think sports is king. Now, again, sports is not just football. In most countries, I think I would say football is king, but, you know, some countries are also, you know, making a considerable effort to develop other sports. You know, I think you have to look at it in terms of your own interest, you know, your own connections, your own access. It's always easier to do business where you have the right connections, where you have the language, where you have, you know, the business environment, the business climate. So I think this is what should drive you in terms of deciding, you know, whether you trade or engage or not. Now, in terms of the, you know, if you want to use sport as a vehicle to trade, clearly there is more demand for certain sports. When we were doing this project, of course, we did a business plan. Do we invest in a badminton field, or do we invest in a soccer field? Do we invest in a fitness, a gym, or do we invest in paddle? I mean, these are some of the analysis we made. You know, who does sport? How often do people come to a fitness center? You know, how many hours a day? How much are they willing to pay? And I think you have to do really a rigorous analysis to be able to decide, you know, what will you invest in and what kind of trade, you know, you will undertake. The reality is, you know, if you look at infrastructure in general, there is opportunity in almost every area. I mean, in Africa, you have basically, we've done the data, you have a soccer field for about 100,000 people, okay? And at the extreme, you have a gymnasium for 8.6 million people. So talk about a gap. I mean, you know, it's scandalous. You know, you have basically athletics, we call it piste, d'athlétisme in French. You know, where you go around and do your 100 meters and 200 meters and 400 meters. You basically have one for every 560,000 people in Africa. Now, how are you going to develop, whether you're talking about excellence or whether you're talking about even serving the youth, amateurs, you know, with this kind of infrastructure gap? So it is really, I think for me, I don't want to diminish the policy agenda. I don't want to diminish, you know, the private sector's role or government's role, unless we address the infrastructure constraint to start with. You know, we will be having this conversation in 30 years and it will be the same, because some people have had this kind of conversation before. So really, opportunity in trade for sure, in all four blocks, big four blocks. You have to look at it in terms of, you know, your own access, your own analysis of the business environment. You know, in some countries, you call a minister, they don't return your call. In some countries, you call them, they do return your calls. Some want, you know, business done, some want to trade, some want to attract investment. And I think these are the kind of things you have to look at.
Great, thank you. And a question to you both. How, you know, in what ways can sports governing bodies in Africa do better? And then kind of pushing that a little bit forward, how can we get them to think in the longer term?
We could start by hiring more strategically from the private sector. I think if we look at the if we look at the makeup of the administration within our sports governing bodies, the general understanding and ability to gain traction with private sector is very limited. And so often it comes back to a narrative of it being your national duty or your responsibility to back a team or back a sport, but without a CMO of a major brand having the ability to take that back to a head office with a justification as to why really we should invest beyond some kind of national pride or national duty. And so I think that the understanding of private sector engagement across governing bodies to drive Africa relevant commercial partnerships is key. And then I also think that on a slightly smaller, more technical point, that policy related to gambling on the continent should be seriously reviewed. I know that in Ghana, the extent to which Bulgarian-owned gambling companies are extracting millions of dollars by the day from the Ghanaian population, and all of that money is leaving the continent. And as you know, originally as an Englishman, we've seen the tremendous impact of the National Lottery on the development of sports in the country. And so I think there's a couple of low-hanging fruits where governing bodies can really apply significant pressure for exploitative industry on the continent and introduce levies, taxes, and also maybe local ownership or government ownership of industries like gambling, which won't go away, but then can drive sports participation and development, where we see some very, very good best practice models around the world that can easily be copied on the continent.
I think sport governing bodies, I mean, to start with, I would say you have to introduce more transparency and within them, and probably, a lot better management practices, like managed like a private sector entity, with the checks and balances and so on. What you have mostly today is basically a club of friends, who get re-elected year after year. I mean, I know a country, I'm not going to name it, but some people around the table would know. A few years ago, a president of a federation was re-elected while he was in jail. Okay? He was in jail for mismanagement of resources of a company he was managing, but he was re-elected as the president of that federation while he was in jail. And when the government decided to remove him, FIFA insisted that he be brought back to his position, and that or the country would be suspended from international competition. Now, what incentive do people like that have to get things right? And I just gave you one example. I know many. So I think these governing bodies have to have some checks and balances. They have to have some accountability to make them function really like boards that if you don't deliver, you get out. So I would say more transparency, certainly a lot more democratic processes within them, and also they should be judged on basis of their results. Are the teams doing right? Are they getting the right equipment? Are the facilities being managed? In some countries, the national team cannot even play on the national stadium. They have to go to a different country to play a national game against a country, a third country, because they don't have the right field. Although, you would have this budgeted at the beginning of the year. So these are very, very concrete, I would say explicit problems that we all know. And unless you change that, I think it will be very, very difficult to bring the sport in Africa to the level that would make it, I think, to make it even with what is expected as best practice. Now, what I'm saying is not just Africa. We've also seen in federations in some European countries or Latin America countries where presidents have stayed for 20, 25 years. So it's not an Africa-specific problem. I think it's a sports problem and sports federation problem, the way they were designed maybe 60 years ago, and nobody wants to lose advantages that were put in place since then. That's my view. A lot of work needs to be done in this area, definitely.
Thank you both for that. The one thing we haven't touched as much on that I don't know if we really have time is the media and how the African sports media can better work with organizations such as yours to help benefit the larger ecosystem. Do either of you have any quick thoughts on how on that end?
I have a lot of thoughts, but I can try and go quickly. But we need to develop the media capacity to tell the story the way that we want to tell it. I think if you look at the difference between a Mo Farah and his story and his profile with a British passport, as opposed to the almost uncountable other East African world-class, world-dominating athletes that we see in track and field. And sort of the dehumanization of African athletes in sort of subconscious media trends towards African athletes. I think that there's a significant problem there, and until we tell the African story in the way that only Africa can, and represent our athletes in the way that we want to, and prioritize the middle-class African sports consumer in the narrative before we worry about the international market in the way that those stories are told, we won't be able to develop authentic storytelling and media coverage. So I think that there's a massive piece of work to be done there, and that links back into private sector's reluctance to engage in sports generally, because the narrative is not conducive to the broader private sector agenda around Africa.
I think just a few ideas. I mean, not in any structured order, but I think one of the advantages of I think the UN system is that you have access to grant resources, you have access to some soft resources, you can organize fundraising, you can raise awareness on issues globally, and I think that that's an area that really needs to be looked at, to see how people like us who are on the ground can actually work with you to expand, at least locally, each at our own level, these efforts. So to me, I see that as a possibility. But we are already working with the federations, we are working with the Olympic Committee, we are working, of course, with the UN agencies on the ground. Sports is not a big focus for them at this point, I must be honest. But I think, when you approach it through the gender angle, when you approach it through the disability angle, when you approach it through the economic empowerment angle, the education angle, then you tend to get some attention. So, I think these are the kind of efforts we need to do. There's no clear-cut solution. It's not evident. It's not going to work everywhere. But I think just the fact that there's conversation around these issues today for me is an important beginning, and that's why I decided to participate in this webinar, because I think the issue needs to be escalated, it needs to be expanded so that more people hear about it, and but I think you also need to come with very concrete solution, low-hanging fruits, a grant here and there, exposure with I think high-level UN representatives talking about some of these issues also would help. And these are some of the ideas I think we need to explore.
Thank you. Certainly the media aspect and the storytelling and how we tell the story is certainly vital to all of this. We are at time. As we leave, before I hand the mic back over to Gabriel, Tom, Madani, I wonder if you could both leave us. What is the key takeaway that you want our audience to walk away with from our conversation today?
I'll let Tom start.
I think that the key thing is we've certainly outlined a lot of challenges. But in 22 years developing football across Africa, there's very little that is more rewarding in the world than what comes from this. And I'm a big believer in the principle of Ubuntu that Desmond Tutu has, beautifully articulated to the world. And I think that the involvement in the development of sport in Africa is one of the most rewarding journeys you can go on for your soul, and one of the most important fights that needs to be taken in the world today. So while there are these challenges, and while it is certainly difficult, and we've got major things to work through, I think that the rewards for putting a life into this space come on many different levels, and there aren't many things that can kind of compete. So I hope that we've sort of posed some challenges that need to be taken up, and highlighted some risks, but not at the expense of dampening the enthusiasm that we obviously both have, and the fantastic opportunities and rewards that exist as a result.
I come away with a mixed feeling a little bit. For me, I think, although both need serious discussion, I think amateur sport and professional sport should be discussed separately, because they're not the same, and the solutions are not the same for each. They're complementary, but if you want to tackle issues regarding professional sport, sports as an economic entity, it's a separate conversation than sports with the youth, sports with the disabled, sports with the, at the local level for personal enrichment and so on. And I think by mixing the two, you may have a sense that, solutions you are proposing make sense, but they will be very difficult to implement. I think what we need is specific implementation on specific problems that are identified for particular sport issues. If you don't do that, even at the policy level, I think, if you come to a country and say, we want to redress the professional football and make sure that, the young talents stay in Africa, and that's a specific set of problems that will not address the problem of, sport infrastructure for people who want to swim, for people who want to do basketball, for people who want to do athletics, and so on, in schools. So I think all are important, but there needs to be some kind of segmentation so that we address all of them in due course, with priorities that will shift depending on the country, depending on the appetite you have in the country, depending on the opportunity you have to bring in private sector money or private sector initiatives. For me, it's much easier to develop an infrastructure complex, to develop football, fitness, Olympic swimming, athletics, than to say, I'm going to develop horseback riding or golf or whatever. And that's my reality. Again, like I said, for private sector, it has to be sustainable. Therefore, it has to generate resources. That's the only way to make it last. It cannot be something you do just as a good Samaritan. And I think that has to be understood. So I think that's where international organizations and governments have to come in, maybe support those areas that are not as economically attractive, so that they complete the picture of sports taken as a whole. So that's I would say that's the sense I'm leaving the conversation with. There is a lot to be done, and it's not easy. And it won't be easy going forward. Thank you.
Very, very good points, both. Thank you so much, both for that, as well as for your insights over the course of the past hour. You've covered a lot of territory, and I think there's obviously a lot more to this conversation, but a lot of good starting points in terms of moving forward. Speaking of moving forward, I will pass the baton to Gabriel. Thank you so much for bringing us together today. It's always a pleasure, and I always learn so much from our panelists.
Thank you so much for doing such a great job. Really appreciate it. Yeah, as you said, thanks to everyone who attended. We really do appreciate it. We really do hope that you've taken something tangible from our panelists. They've shared such rich information. I mean, I was taking notes. I could have gone on longer, but yeah, it was really, really good. So thanks again to David Luke, to Lindsay, to Tom, Madani for your insights and everything that you've done. Also, I want to say thanks to ATPC and UNECA again. Obviously, without you guys, we couldn't have made this possible. So thanks again in that. And just to give you a heads up, this is not a one-off. I know there's things that Tom and Madani have said about thinking long-term and putting in the work. But yeah, this is definitely not a one-off. We do have another event planned in July, 22nd of July. So please put that in your diaries. I'm sure you're thinking, what's the topic? We'll let you know in due time. But yeah, just make note of that. And on top of that as well, just to let you know, we are doing some research too, conducting some research, which we'll let you know once that's completed. Madani touched on Qatar and the work that they're doing. Part of the research touches on that, and also as well how to engage with the youth and consumer engagement. We also do have a mentorship program that has launched. So for any youth who want to, learn more about sports and trade, then please feel free to apply for that. We'll let you know when the post event comes about all of that. But once again, thanks so much to our panelists, the people who have attended. And we hope that you've actually taken something tangible, whether it's some insight that you didn't know about, maybe it's just giving you an extra spring in your step, to motivate you to continue to do what you've already done. It's a real pleasure to have both Tom and Madani, who are so seasoned, and even Lindsay, seasoned in what they've done in sports on the continent. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you again. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Great. Thank you so much.